Hello, this is Christopher Lee. Time for a fireside tale. Feeling sleepy? Try to stay awake whatever you do as you listen to tonight's sinuous story by Ambrose Bierce, The Man and the Snake. It is a veritable report that ye serpent, his eye hath a magnetic property, that whoso falleth into its suasion is drawn forwards in despite of his will, and perisheth miserable by ye creature his spite. Stretched at ease upon a sofa in gown and slippers, Harker Brayton smiled as he read the foregoing sentence in old Morister's Marvels of Science. The only marvel in the matter, he said to himself, is that the wise and learned in Morister's day should have believed such nonsense. And he unconsciously lowered his book without altering the direction of his eyes. What he saw in the shadow under his bed were two small points of light, apparently about an inch apart. He gave them but little thought and resumed his reading. A moment later, something impelled him to lower the book again. The points of light were still there. They seemed to have become brighter than before, shining with a greenish luster which he had not at first observed. He thought, too, that they might have moved a trifle, were somewhat nearer. They were still too much in the shadow, however, to reveal their nature and origin to an indolent attention, and he resumed his reading. Suddenly, something in the text suggested a thought which made him start and drop the book for the third time to the side of the sofa. Brayton, half risen, was staring intently into the obscurity beneath the bed, where the points of light shone with, it seemed to him, an added fire. His attention was now fully aroused, his gaze eager and imperative. It disclosed, almost directly beneath the footrail of the bed, the coils of a large serpent. The points of light were its eyes, its horrible head thrust flatly forth from the innermost coil and resting upon the outermost was directed straight toward him. The definition of the wide, brutal jaw and the idiot-like forehead serving to show the direction of its malevolent gaze. The eyes were no longer merely luminous points. They looked into his own with a meaning, a malign significance. Harker Brayton, a bachelor of 35, had returned to San Francisco from all manner of remote and unfamiliar countries. He had gladly accepted the hospitality of his friend, Dr. Druring, the distinguished scientist. Dr. Druring's house, a large old-fashioned one in what was now an obscure quarter of the city, had developed some of the eccentricities which come of isolation. One of these was a wing, conspicuously irrelevant in point of architecture. It was here that the doctor indulged to the scientific side of his nature, in the study of such forms of animal life as engaged his interest and comforted his taste. His scientific sympathies were distinctly reptilian. His wife and daughters were, with needless austerity, excluded from what he called the snakery. The snakery had a severe simplicity befitting the humble circumstances of its occupants. However, they were under as little personal restraint as was compatible with their protection from the baneful habit of swallowing one another. and as Brayton had thoughtfully been apprised, some of them had, at divers times, been found in parts of the premises where it would have embarrassed them to explain their presence. Mr. Brayton was not greatly affected. His first thought was to ring the call bell and bring a servant, but although the bell cord dangled within easy reach, he made no movement toward it. It had occurred to his mind that the act might subject him to the suspicion of fear, which he certainly did not feel. The reptile was of a species with which Brayton was unfamiliar. Its length he could only conjecture. The body at the largest visible part seemed almost as thick as his forearm. Was it venomous? Was it a constrictor? His knowledge of nature's danger signals did not enable him to say. If not dangerous, the creature was at least offensive. It was de trop, an impertinence. Brayton rose to his feet and prepared to back softly away from the snake. He knew that he could walk backward without obstruction and find the door without error. In the meantime, the snake's eyes burned with a more pitiless malevolence than ever. Brayton lifted his right foot free of the floor to step backward. That moment, he felt a strong aversion to doing so. "I'm accounted brave," he murmured. "Is bravery, then, no more than pride? Because there are none to witness the shame, shall I retreat?" He was steadying himself with his right hand upon the back of a chair, his foot suspended. "Nonsense," he said aloud. "I'm not so great a coward as to fear to seem to myself afraid." He lifted the foot a little higher by slightly bending the knee and thrust it sharply to the floor, an inch in front of the other. He could not think how that occurred. A trial with the left foot had the same result. It was again in advance of the right. The hand upon the chair back was grasping it. The arm was straight, reaching somewhat backward. One might have seen that he was reluctant to lose his hold. The snake's malignant head was still thrust forth from the inner coil as before, the neck level. It had not moved, but its eyes were now electric sparks, radiating an infinity of luminous needles. The man had an ashy pallor. Again he took a step forward and another, partly dragging the chair, which, when finally released, fell upon the floor with a crash. The man groaned. The snake made neither sound nor motion, but its eyes were two dazzling suns. The reptile itself was wholly concealed by them. They gave off enlarging rings of rich and vivid colors, which their greatest expansion successively vanished like soap bubbles. He heard somewhere a continual throbbing of a great drum with desultory bursts of far music, inconceivably sweet like the tones of an Aeolian harp. He knew it for the sunrise melody of Memnon's statue, and thought he stood in the Nile-side reeds, hearing with exalted sense that immortal anthem through the silence of the centuries. A landscape glittering with sun and rain stretched before him, arched with a vivid rainbow. In the middle distance, a vast serpent wearing a crown reared its head and looked at him with his dead mother's eyes. Suddenly, this enchanting landscape seemed to rise swiftly upward and vanished. Something struck him a hard blow upon the face and breast. He had fallen to the floor. The blood ran from his broken nose and his bruised lips. In a few moments he had recovered, and then realized that his fall, by withdrawing his eyes, had broken the spell which held him. But the thought of the serpent within a few feet of his head, yet unseen, perhaps in the very act of springing upon him and throwing its coils about his throat, was too horrible. He lifted his head, stared again into those baleful eyes, and was again in bondage. The snake had not moved. Beneath that flat and brainless brow, its black, beady eyes simply glittered with an expression unspeakably malignant. Now ensued a fearful scene. The man, prone upon the floor, within a yard of his enemy, raised the upper part of his body upon his elbows, his head thrown back, the legs extended to their full length. His face was white between its gouts of blood. His eyes were strained open to their uttermost expansion. There was froth upon his lips. It dropped off in flakes. Strong convulsions ran through his body, making almost serpentine undulations. He bent himself at the waist, shifting his legs from side to side. At every movement left him a little nearer to the snake. He thrust his hands forward to brace himself back, yet constantly advanced upon his elbows. Dr. Druring and his wife sat in the library. The scientist was in rare good humor. I have just obtained a splendid specimen of the Ophiopagus. And what may that be? The lady inquired with a somewhat languid interest. The Ophiopagus is a snake which eats other snakes. I hope it will eat all yours. But how does it get the other snakes? By charming them, I suppose. Ah! The conversation was interrupted by a mighty cry. Ah! Again and yet again it sounded with terrible distinctness. Ah! They rushed at the door without knocking. It was unfastened and gave way. Brayton lay upon his stomach on the floor, dead. His head and arms were partly concealed under the footrail of the bed. They pulled the body away, turning it upon the back. The face was daubed with blood and froth. The eyes were wide open, staring, a dreadful sight. Died in a fit? Said the scientist, bending his knee and placing his hand upon the heart. While in that position, he happened to glance under the bed. Good God! How did this thing get in here? He reached under the bed, pulled out the snake, and flung it, still coiled, to the center of the room, whence, with a harsh, shuffling sound, it slid across the polished floor till stopped by the wall, where it lay without motion. It was a stuffed snake. Its eyes were 2 shoe buttons. Now, have you checked under the bed? This is Christopher Lee wishing you a very good night.